Welcome everyone to our fourth and final afternoon session of the Ending the Korean War Symposium. I'm Lisa Lowe, a professor here at Yale, where we're pleased to host the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective. And our final session is a dynamic conversation between members of the EKW and invited scholars examining the links between US wars in the Philippines, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Just a few notes about the webinar. If this is the first session you're attending, the webinar is being recorded and we will spotlight the speakers for you, and we recommend selecting speaker view in the upper right-hand corner for your best experience. You can submit your questions in the Q&A box, and this will appear for many of you on the bottom bar. If not, you might look under the three dots more. And a member of the EKW collective will be reviewing the questions and then, time permitting, posing them at the end of the panel. So let us turn now to our final exciting session, Genealogy of the Gook, Anti-Asian Racism Across the US Wars in the Philippines, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jenna Kim, and I'm one of the core members of Ending the Korean War Collective. Thank you so much to the members of EKW, to Lisa Lowe, and to Min Vu for making this session possible. We have been, this is the last of the 4 sessions where we are introducing our syllabus project, in particular, our Race, War, and Empire module. And Genealogies of the Gook, from Anti-Asian Racism to Solidarity Across U.S. Empire, is one of the sub-modules of Race, War, and Empire. And we wanted to give an opportunity to think about the generative ways in which, thinking about this term, through different imperial histories and wars, can, have us understand, can come to alliances, across difference. And so let me first introduce who we'll be in discussion with. We have Jocelyn Diaz, Nerissa Balse, Sunghoon Kim, Ma Vang, Keva Bui, and Junyoung Veronica Kim. They'll all introduce themselves. And then I'll offer a framing entrance into our discussion. And then I'll ask everyone 2 questions, which they'll take about 10 minutes to answer. And then we'll open it into general discussion. And so this framing discussion, comes from the introduction to the genealogy of the Gook submodule, from the Race, War, and Empire section of our syllabus. And here we write that Korean Americans are weaned on an apocryphal tale around the term Gook. When sighting U.S. soldiers, our ancestors excitedly, apparently, shouted Migook, Migook, or United States, translated to beautiful country, as a way of remarking the presence of American troops deployed to the Korean theater during the early 1950s. Yet, in the context of asymmetrical war, the metonym that designated the foreigner was instead turned lethally against Koreans when GIs misunderstood me to mean what it does in English, namely a reference to self, and Gook to be a term for Korean. Scrambled in this way, with its intended sense lost in translation, the phrase was taken to mean I am a Gook, and another level, kill me and my kind without consequences. Yet, as many people have pointed out, this apocryphal account obscures the slur's pan-racist past, to borrow a phrase from David Roediger. Gook cannot be claimed, this is to say, by Koreans alone. Although its origins occasion some debate, with scholars recognizing that the term circulated in outside of Asia, including the Caribbean, the slur traversed U.S. imperialist war fronts in Asia across the 20th century, taking on a new life in each theater of war as a term designating the killability of de-individualized Asian life. So this apocryphal story is one to which many of us are familiar. It's the way through which I became acquainted with the term Gook. I always thought that it originated from the Korean context. And so in this context, it prompts us to reconsider how militarism and imperial war serve as a structural basis for anti-Asian racism. From the Philippine-American War to the Korean War to the Vietnam War, Gook is a part of a U.S. imperial military lexicon, a vocabulary of psychological warfare that conjoins people targeted by the U.S. war machine. Associated with women who followed U.S. forces, in Korean War parlance, blanket squads. The term arises in the context of the U.S. imperial war in the Philippines as a way of contemptuously referring to Native peoples. The gendered and sexualized connotations arguably persist in the racialized viability that the term implies. And by the time slur's itinerary reached Southeast Asia in the mid-20th century, its association with disposable Asian life was cemented. Yet even as this counterinsurgent term has served an undeniably lethal function, how does it perversely serve as a grounds for imagining solidarity across histories and geographies of imperialist war? So I wanted to offer this sort of framing as a way to think about how our discussion with the interlocutors will go today. And the first question that I had for everyone is, we've asked people to bring an object that helps talk through the way that their accounting of the term Gook. And so we wanted to invite you to introduce your object and offer an account of how term Gook circulated in the racialized context of war and empire that you study or impacted by. And then the second question, to go back to the ending part of the frame, how might Gook then serve as the grounds for imagining and enacting solidarity across histories of imperialist war and occupation? So we'll start with Narissa.
Okay, good afternoon. As we say in my country, magandang hapon. Good afternoon or magandang umaga to folks in the West Coast. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this very important symposium, Lisa, Christine, the seen and unseen members of the EKW Collective. I'm honored to share my work on the afterlives of the Philippine-American War of 1899 to 1902 in this moment of US-sponsored genocide and war in Gaza. As a Filipina immigrant scholar, I am looking forward to our conversation of the things left behind by imperial wars in Asia, the seen and unseen, the invisible and the effective, the lived realities that we all intimately know are part of our inheritance as descendants of colonized subjects, as immigrants and refugees living in the US. So in my work, I write about the legacies of the Filipino-American War. The Philippine-American War was a war that claimed close to 1 million Filipino lives, and that is contested. What is not contested is that the war destroyed land, destroyed families and traditional livelihoods, created the notions of saviors and enemies, a war that tethered our economy and our governance to the US for more than a century, and it continues to this day. At the turn of the 20th century, the Philippine colony was America's Congo, the dark heart of the American empire, with a guerrilla war led by Filipino revolutionaries or katipuneros, who were called insurrectos by the Americans. And the war cost close to $50 million in its first year alone. And the war lasted for 4 long years. I hope that everyone is able to see the slide that I prepared. I think that, there we go. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, that's the slide. The cost of the war, its growing unpopularity among Black and white Americans, the military censorship regarding the actual number of deaths of American soldiers and Filipino civilians, and US congressional debates regarding torture and atrocities committed by American soldiers in the Philippines highlight the abject status of the Philippine-American War in the American popular memory. There are no monuments for this war. a war that is the historical trauma that formed Filipino America. I study the legacies of this war because I take seriously what the Filipina-American novelist Gina Apostol once said, and this is a quote from Gina Apostol: "Forgetting is an aspect of genocide." And I constantly think about this. What does it mean that forgetting is an aspect of genocide? So I turn to and study the US empire to remember the violence and imagine another world, another Filipino future. So let's begin by tracking the term Gugu through the lens of politicized objection. And politicized objection is a term I borrow loosely from the queer theorist Alberto Sandoval Sanchez. And for him, objection is the mierda y sangre, the shit and blood of empire. Objection is the production of the horror of the racial other, often the scapegoat, the feminine, the savage, those who are subjects of American imperialist violence and racist desire. To be called a Gugu, and of course, consequently to be called a Gook, meant death for those who are viewed by the empire as Gugu or Gook. The term Gugu and insurrecto were terms used interchangeably by American soldiers and officers during the Philippine-American War. And it has apocryphal origins too. It might refer to this plant called gogo, which was used as soap, indigenous or Filipino soap. But for the term Gugu, we can think of slurs then as the shit and blood of empire, the remains of empire, what haunts, the terms left behind after wars, violent military occupation, and the destruction of land and lives have happened. So what we see on this slide, we see a small green book. I didn't want to make it too big as an image, but the book here is a violent, sensationalist memoir published in 1910 entitled "I've Killed Men." And it was, when it was published in 1959 by an American publisher, it was marketed as, not surprisingly, as Americana, cowboy fiction. The author is an American soldier who recalls his days as a gunslinging cowboy and later as a soldier in the Philippine-American War. And chapters of the memoir use the slur Gugu. In David Roediger's and Paul Kramer's work, Gugu was the linguistic ancestor of the term Gook. The 19th century meaning of Gook refers to both dirt and prostitute. And so when American soldiers during the war, the Philippine-American War, sang raunchy sexual songs about the Gugu-eyed Filipinas and shortened the term to Gook, this angered Filipinos. Americans thus found a slur to taunt their brown enemies. The postcard we see on this slide represents the sexualized image of the Gugu. And of course, in the lower part of the slide, we see a picture of a ravaged Filipino town taken after a military encounter between the American Army and the Filipinos. And this is an unpublished archival photograph and shows the fate of the Gugus. If I may ask for the next slide, please. Thank you. So in the 21st century, the Gugu and the Gook are the afterlives of the US empire. So slurs are the afterlives of empire. The histories of the Philippine-American War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War are important areas of study in the military science known as irregular warfare or counterinsurgency. As a field of military science, counterinsurgency requires the narration of an efficient and effective way of conducting war against combatants who dress like ordinary civilians because they don't have the uniforms. So this narration requires objection as a structure of discourse. Waging war without humanizing enemy casualties, abstracting or erasing blood and bones by turning actual bodies into body counts and statistics, and emphasizing military victory over ethical or moral concerns. So if we think of objection as a way to understand the slur Gugu and Gook, Abjection also can be useful in thinking about the language of counterinsurgency studies that narrates death without carnage. In the American popular imagination, Southeast Asia is the jungle of snakes. And that's a term from a writer, a soldier who had a report about counterinsurgency. And so Southeast Asia is the place where memories of genocidal campaigns conducted by the US military and the guerrilla wars against the American army still haunt the nightmares of American soldiers, the survivors, the refugees, and those, the civilians who, the descendants of civilians. So I'd like to end with two different images that document the Gugu and the Gook in popular culture. So on one side, the 2005 military article lists the various successful counterinsurgencies. And then on the other side of of our slide, we see the humor, an essay on films and the representation, the sexualized representation of Asian women, a film essay by Jessica Hagedorn that was published in 1994 in Miss Magazine. She begins her film essay with a taxonomy of gendered and imperialist slurs, but she ends her taxonomy with beauty. The Gugu and the Gook is also mother, wife, lover, daughter, and sister. Okay, so with that, I'd like to turn now to the next presenter, Josen.
Thank you, Nerissa. Yes, next speaker is Josen.
Hi, okay. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Josen Diaz. Thank you to the Ending the Korean War Collective for gathering us, of course, and for the invaluable political education work that you all have been doing for so long. Also to Lisa Lowe, to Min Vu, and the team at Yale for supporting this symposium. And so Nerissa's comments are really helpful. They help to really frame really well my own kind of thoughts. But to just sort of reiterate, some historians, as Nerissa mentioned, point to the US soldiers' usage of the term Gook during the Philippine-American War at the turn of the 20th century as a pejorative to describe not only the Filipino enemy, but also his killability under war. So we can look at countless images in US archives of US soldiers standing next to the mangled bodies of Filipino soldiers to illustrate this point. And so Gook, the Gook, right, situates Filipinos within a system of racial classification within the burgeoning US empire. And for me, I view the Gook as the historical precedent for contemporary articulations of Filipino raciality under US empire. So my work in general is largely concerned with authoritarianism as well as liberalism and the ways that histories and cultures of colonialism and empire help us understand the relationship between the two. And so to that end, my object, I wanted to share a passage of Emmanuel Lacaba's poem, Open Letter to Filipino Artists. And here is a passage of the poem. The poem itself includes 3 separate poems that Lacaba wrote while he was fighting with the New People's Army, the armed wing of the Communist Party of the Philippines. Lacaba was a poet and an educator. He joined the New People's Army in 1974 and was assassinated by Philippine soldiers in 1976, which is the same year that he wrote this portion of the poem. Lacaba dedicated his life to waging a fierce struggle against Ferdinand Marcos's political regime, as many of us know, a US-backed dictatorship that held office for over 20 years. And throughout his time in office, Marcos routinely ordered the killings of resistance fighters like Lacaba, as well as numerous political critics and opponents. Lacaba's biographer, Sylvia Mendez Ventura, noted that Lacaba's poetry oftentimes employed images of death, and his work, as you can see here, describes the ways that death structures Filipino life under the authoritarian state. So the term salvaging came to name the brutal murders under the regime. It described the authoritarian tactic of suppression and containment that rendered Filipinos expendable, disposable, killable, and its expendability was only made possible by the US militarism that armed and upheld the regime. In the poem that we placed here, Lacaba's use of the plural fascists pinpoints multiple actors, including the military quote-unquote partnership between the Philippines and the United States. This alliance was a critical arm of the US quote-unquote self-defense program in Asia throughout Oceania. And with US support, Marcos himself strengthened the Philippine Armed Forces, sent troops to Vietnam as part of Lyndon B. Johnson's More Flags program, extended the US lease on Clark Air Base and Naval Base Subic Bay, secured a military arsenal from the United States as part of the regime's efforts to suppress guerrilla forces throughout the country. And Walden Bello has written that the United States gave, quote, the Philippine dictatorship close to $2.5 billion in bilateral military and economic assistance and about $5.5 billion through the major multilateral institutions between the years 1972 and 1983. So I bring this up in part because, at least for my work, I want to point to salvaging as materializing within the same racial lexicon that produced the Gook at the turn of the 20th century. It's an order of death that emerges at the intersection of state security and unending warfare under US colonialism and imperialism. Salvaging as extrajudicial killing is rooted in a long history, like Nerissa mentioned, of counterinsurgency in the Philippines. And by counterinsurgency, of course, I mean the unending collusion between the Philippine state and US militarization in the name of colonial and imperial security. The formation of the sovereign Philippine state, of course, begins alongside the formal development of CIA-led counterinsurgency programs in the Philippines and against rebel groups like the Hukbalahaps and the rise of the Communist Party of the Philippines. And many of us know that the US identification of the communist threat is also an articulation of a racialized and sexualized threat to empire. But another way to say this is that counterinsurgency renders decolonial and anti-colonial struggles as racialized and sexualized threats that need to be suppressed. And so peasants, farmers, indigenous people, and queer and trans people, as Junyoung actually mentioned and referenced yesterday, are oftentimes the targets of these very counterinsurgency programs. And so again, my point is that rather than pinpoint a distinct origin story, I think it's important to understand how and why the Gook emerges and reemerges at different historical and political struggles. And so the second question, I was also drawn to Lacaba's poem to help answer the second question about solidarity. I think of Lacaba's poem as an articulation of solidarity against the Gook as a racial classification. So in this passage, please note the interplay, right, between tribeless and our tribes, between homeless and our homes, between nameless and our names. That exchanges the ethno-nationalism of the Philippine authoritarian state for a people's resistance against fascism. There is, of course, at the very end, a reference to Robert Frost's poem where Lacaba exchanges the I for the we. And here, people is constituted by shared histories, by shared struggles. It's continuous, it's ongoing, it's emergent. This line here, these couple lines, the barefoot army of the wilderness, we should all be in time, awakened, the masses are Messiah. I read the poem's barefoot army as anti-fascist, anti-colonial resistance that can help guide us into visions of solidarity right now. And to this end, I want to note and end with two examples. In November of 2023, protesters mobilized against the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in San Francisco. The summit convened world leaders, including current Philippine President Bongbong Marcos, and of course the son of Ferdinand Marcos, and People's Republic of China President Xi Jinping, and business leaders to strategize around development opportunities in the quote-unquote Asia-Pacific. The No to APEC coalition brought together over 100 grassroots community action organizations nationwide, active in the fields of migrant and immigrant rights, indigenous rights, human rights, labor rights, climate and environmental justice groups, women's groups, and more. The coalition, and again, I kind of think of the barefoot army, the coalition gathered to denounce these development projects as disastrous for the land and for the environment, and pointed to development projects as disastrous, pointed to the ways that indigenous people and the working people of the global South bear the brunt of ecological and economic damage. A second example, in July of 2024, activists gathered in San Diego to call for the cancellation of the Rim of the Pacific exercise, or RIMPAC, a biannual series of US-led maritime war exercises held in Hawaii and led by the US Navy's Indo-Pacific Command. The convening assembled, among other nations, the Philippines, the Republic of Korea, Japan, India, Mexico, and Israel, amidst the backdrop of the US-maintained Israeli onslaught in Gaza and escalating tensions between China and the United States, and illuminates, of course, the consequences of this wide-scale militarization. And so, again, I am drawn to Lagaba's poem because I think it reminds me of these recent people's efforts that have fashioned new definitions of self-determination by enacting solidarities that generate critical theorizations of military power. These coalitional movements reject the pronouncements of development and peace promoted by the United States and its allies. They argue that such declarations require the solidification of militarized empire, which depends upon the continuity of colonial alliances, and their critique helps describe a resistance against the war machine that is transnational, that is multi-sided, and that's attuned to the historical present and to all of its possible futures. Thank you. So I'm going to turn now to Sunglan.
Hi, everyone. For those of you who are joining new, my name is Hung Eun. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard, and I specialize in the racial and sexual politics of colonial soldiering at the intersection of Korean militarism and US empire in the Asia-Pacific region. So the objects that I bring, because I served as a racialized soldier as part of my conscript service for South Korea, as a racially integrated soldier, that is the Korean augmentation troops that you see here, are much more personal. And so what I'm bringing is one, the vaccination on the top left that you see here that was given to a Korean civilian worker in a US military base in the early 1970s, right? And on the right bottom here, this is actually the Johnson & Johnson Janssen vaccine that Biden had sent over when there was huge shortage of vaccines upon the outbreak of the Korean War, and this is actually the vaccination that I got. And for those of you who don't know, one of the first Korean, to be vaccinated on the peninsula were Katusa soldiers, precisely because they were stationed either in U.S. military base or were veterans like me. And I think this says something about, and there was a bit of an uncanniness to this, because I think there was huge preference at the time that I was getting this vaccination for the other ones, Pfizer or Moderna, because there were actually quality control problems. And a lot of these Johnson & Johnson vaccines were getting disposed of, right? Because of the steadfast sort of US ROK alliance, that I was given this free way, so to speak. And I bring this in conversation with the genealogy of Gook, because the ways in which Gook appears in the archives for me when I do my research on the Katusas is always in the context of our lesser and worthless and disposable racialized Asian ally who are never sort of good enough to be full soldiers. And there is a kind of a biopolitical care in which, all these kinds of, not just to the soldiers, but also, the venereal checkups and the kind of biopolitical care that comes within the bases and around US military camp towns that continue to this day. But there's also this always a kind of evaluation is who is worthy of living and who can always be dispensed, right? So for instance, I am getting this vaccination ahead of other population in Korea as a veteran because I am still in the reserve force and I could be mobilized at any time to fight an enemy, right? And I think this kind of killability and violability is intrinsic to the logic of US military empire and how the racialization functions on this kind of racialized scheme. If you could go to the next slide, please. And so it is in this kind of context that we must think about how do we address the issue of racism within US military? So, I'm again uplifting here a primary document that we've uploaded onto our syllabus, right? But it's again sort of looking at the genealogy of Gook that consigns and reinforces the alliance, right? So although Walter Sullivan here is a very acute journalist for that time, to be able to address racism within the alliance, right? The kind of consignment of racism as a problem to be addressed instills a sense of racial progress, and that we could that US military could always improve, and that this is something, and that participation in this kinds of racialized scheme is something beneficial to both the US military and to South Korea. And I just want to point out here that you see this kind of thing. Gook is always pegged to US military and the way they see their lesser allies. And I think Junyoung will probably touch on Haiti, but there's also in the Philippines, for instance, in Subic Bay, the shit, it's literally called the shitwater, euphemistically located outside of the US military base at Subic Bay. And this river had been polluted by the human feces of American soldiers. But however, when observing local Filipinos swimming in the river, US soldiers refer to them as filthy gooks, right? And I think what this kind of contradiction reveals is how the US military constructs and reinforces masculinity and employs derogatory language to dehumanize and demean locals, despite having created the scenarios that, for example, enabled sexual violence and produced unsanitary conditions. And so I think we really have to think critically about, especially at this contemporary moment when the Trump administration is about to get to Japan, about to turn to Japan and Korea, and come up with this anti-Asian rhetoric that our allies are not doing enough and they are free riders, right? And I just want to point out that perhaps I got that vaccine for free, but at what cost, right? At what cost to indigenous people who have been silenced, not just in Korea, but across the Pacific? And on this note, I will turn things over to our next speaker.
Yeah, thank you so much. So thank you to Christine and the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective for this generous invitation and an opportunity to participate in such a generative conversation. Thank you to Lisa and Min and those at Yale for hosting us today. So my name is Kevin Bui. I'm a scholar of race, war, and empire, and I'm currently an assistant professor of Asian American Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And so in my general body of work, I examine the histories of weapons of mass destruction and how certain racial logics of Asian enmity and killability shape the scientific research and development of these weapons. So for our conversation today here on the genealogy of the Gook, I want to begin with this image from the Asian American anti-war movement of the 1970s. And so shortly after their establishment in 1972, the Bay Area Asian Coalition Against the War, or BACAL for short, released this pamphlet as a political education document, explaining why a coalition of Asian American anti-war activists was necessary at a moment where coalescing as Asian Americans rather than in separate ethnic silos was still a nascent political formation. And so here, BACAL invokes the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as analogies for the napalm and carpet bombing of Vietnam, not as isolated events in discrete locations, but as a longer genealogy of United States aggression against Asian and Third World people. The atomic bomb, which is often heralded as this pinnacle of scientific and military achievement, is instead shown to cohere a logic of anti-Asian racism that formed the heart of the US war machine. The pamphlet continues on to make connections between the massacres of the Philippine-American War, atomic bombings, and bacteriological warfare during the Korean War, alongside the Vietnam War. In doing so, Bacall historicizes a long genealogy of Asian killability that inheres in weapons of mass destruction. So across this history of weapons of mass destruction, we see the racial logic of the Gook, a category of racial killability that sets the very political conditions through which war may unfold. And so this racial logic of killability is very pervasive across US wars and US war and empire in Asia. And it coheres in the slur Gook, a term that, as my fellow speakers have attested to, has traveled across US imperial wars in the Philippines, Korea, and Vietnam to construct Asians as a distinct race to be killed. What happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in Bacall's words, is directly linked to the present racist and genocidal acts being committed in Vietnam, at the time cementing an activist view of US imperialist warfare as an act of genocide. And so while it is rarely used today in reference to US military intervention in Vietnam, genocide is a common charge leveled at the US government by activists protesting imperialist interventions of the time. The charge of genocide has been crucial to this longer history of anti-imperial and anti-racist activism against the United States. It is well established that the US opposed the 1948 UN Convention, UN Genocide Convention, under the knowledge that it created a juridical foundation upon which the US could itself be charged with international crimes against humanity. And if we can go to the next slide, please. And so, of course, the US was charged. In 1951, the Black Civil Rights Congress penned their We Charge Genocide petition, charging that centuries of anti-Black racism instituted through institutions of chattel slavery, mass incarceration, Jim Crow segregation, and the sterilization of Black women amounted to the heinous act of genocide. And so while the United Nations ultimately refused to hear this petition, the We Charge Genocide petition stands as an important moment when the language of international humanitarian law was leveraged against US crimes of racism and imperialism. Importantly, the Black Civil Rights Congress understood that anti-Black racism did not happen in a vacuum, but that technologies of imperialism are interconnected through logics of genocide. And so the way in which they equate jellied gasoline in Korea or napalm bombs with the technologies of lynching in the United States. And so thinking about how this logic of lynching, napalm bombing, the atom bomb are linked through technologies of mass destruction. And so what this group of Black activists fundamentally understood is the transnational nature of US genocide, an imperialist war machine that constructs racial killability across institutions of anti-Black and anti-Asian racism. And so importantly, this shared killability becomes the basis for terms of solidarity, where identifying people of color in the United States as natural allies for third world liberation movements precisely because of shared vulnerability to US imperialist warfare and racial genocide. And so this shared logics of killability, these technologies are not just instruments of mass death, but they're racial knowledge formations that construct the very subject who is slated for killing in what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls state-sanctioned vulnerability to premature death. And so we can go to the next slide, please. And so these terms of solidarity become crucial to the Asian American movement, as we see here. This pamphlet is another political education document urging for the unity of Asians in America as Asian Americans, distributed by the Asian Solidarity Committee, a student anti-war group at UC Berkeley in the 1970s. Again, we see solidarity cohering in the killability of Asians and how such solidarity became the basis for a transnational affinity between Asians in the United States and Asians in Asia. And so it's worth reading this quote at length. The American government tells us that the United States is fighting in Asia to protect democracy and to protect Asians from communism. But we see pictures of Viet Cong children brutalized and mutilated by American bombs, American napalm, and American bullets. We realize that they could be our little brothers and sisters. We realize that Gook means someone with golden skin, almond eyes, and black hair, that any Asian is a Gook. We must begin to see beyond that racism that has made these people into less than human Gooks. We must define the truth about Asia and about Asians for ourselves. Perhaps then, we can begin to win some self-determination for ourselves. And so Gook is a racial slur couched within an Orientalist vernacular. It describes the Asian body from the perspective of the scope of a soldier's rifle or the aerial vision of a B-29 that defines its killability in the face of a bullet or a bomb. It binds Asians to a history of war, which then becomes a racialized logic of anti-Asian racism that proliferates both in our domestic and transnational spaces. And so as folks in EKW have consistently spoken about throughout the symposium, this racial logic principally manifests through anti-communism. And so earlier today, on the earlier session, we particularly see that it is a particularly insurgent, communist Asian that becomes racialized as killable across the Philippines and then in Korea and Vietnam during the Cold War, a geopolitical paradigm of Cold War containment. And so like queer activists have reclaimed queer as a derogatory slur to describe the affinity and solidarity across difference, Asian American activists from the anti-war movement understood Gook as a unifying political formation across transnational divides, providing a linkage between domestic anti-Asian racism and imperialism abroad. And so Gook is a term that coheres solidarity if we allow it to recognize how killability is integral to how the US war machine constructs racial others. And so this term holds epistemological import because it travels in sites of US imperialism and warfare. And so more so than communicate a supposed Asiatic quality of the racial other, it is a vocabulary of killability that defines the US war machine's incitement to genocide. Thinking about Gook as a term of racial killability that overdetermines Asian racial formation hopefully can open us to think about broader terms of solidarity. The Gook is inherently related to racial formations of the guerrilla, insurgent, the communist, or the terrorist. These terms are all vocabularies of imperialist warfare. They construct a racialized enemy to be annihilated. And so race becomes encoded in biopolitical and necropolitical terms, where race surfaces not only in skin color, but in the epistemological descriptors that inscribe bodies, populations, and terrain as killable and bombable. And so here, race materializes in the ways that the annihilation of certain peoples is made necessary to sustain and forward a future of liberal democratic governance, where US militarism occludes all pathways otherwise. So across these terms, Asian American anti-war activists have located possibilities for solidarity and how we mutually understand the logics of killability that inhere across Black, Asian, Arab, and other sites of US imperialist genocide, particularly in the current moment, where the specter of racial terror, this potential terrorist subject, provides justification for Israel's ongoing genocide of Palestine. We witness how it is in the very vocabularies of war where the US war machine and the Israel war machine create the conditions of racial killability. And so recognizing how this logic, this vocabulary of war, transmutes and transforms across geographies of empire becomes important for how we develop our networks of solidarity. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it over to the next speaker, who I believe is Ma.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ma Vang. I'm an associate professor of critical race and ethnic studies at UC Merced. And my work looks at US empire and militarism through critical refugee perspectives and knowledge formation. And I also want to thank members of the Ending the Korean War Collective, including Christine, Dong-un, Jung-yeon, and others for organizing this thought-provoking symposium and for inviting me to participate. Thank you to Lisa Lo, Minwoo, and Madeline Han, and others for your integral role in organizing this symposium. And I really just appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this conversation so much for the astute analyses of US empire that we need right now in this moment. So my account of the term Gook and how it circulates in race-making, militarized, and empire or imperial war in Laos is actually by other racial lexicons, as Josen has said earlier. And these other lexicons include tribal, mountain people, ally, soldier, killer, freedom fighter, guerrilla fighter, and mercenary. So these are terms that are specific to the context that I'm looking at. And so I want to put forth this point in terms of Gook and how I'm thinking about it as the killable, right, but also the killer. in the context of the secret war in Laos. So in my research, I look at the US secret war in Laos, the parallel war that was waged by the US, but operated by the CIA as a counterinsurgency and guerrilla war to stop the spread of communism from North Vietnam into Laos, and then eventually Thailand. So in this secret war, which was the largest CIA covert operation, the CIA recruited Hmong among other indigenous groups like Mian, Ka, Khmu, as a proxy army to fight the Laotian front of its multiple conflicts in Southeast Asia. And so this so-called secret war highlighted what Mimi Nguyen calls the continuities and innovations of the imperialist logics that were honed in other imperial and counterinsurgency warfares. Colonial tropes like tribesmen, right, Hmong country, which is reference to sort of the lexicon of Indian country, abound in constructing Laos's difficult terrain as an empty landscape that was not viable for a military base, but valuable as a geographic buffer for communism. In addition, these tropes construct Hmong and other people who live in the highlands of Laos and under overlapping forms of French colonialism, Japanese occupation, and Laotian decolonization, and then US imperialism as part of that landscape, right, as mountain people who could traverse the difficult terrain to fight on behalf of the United States. So these tropes transplanted US settler colonial logics of land dispossession through counterinsurgency to disrupt decolonization movements. And coupled with the Cold War strategy to foster indigenous proxy governments, this imperial war was also a civilizing project to liberate Southeast Asians from the so-called imperialism of communism, right? This is Secretary of State John Dulles, his words, and really to bring Hmong people into modernity through development projects. And US aid was integral in this military project. So this unauthorized war was a violation of the 1954 Geneva Accords that was established after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which marked the transition from French colonialism to independence for the Southeast Asian countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The 1954 Accords, and then the second set of accords in 1962, stipulated that these three nations should remain neutral from foreign and military intervention as they work toward decolonizing. And like many Korean and Korean American scholars have noted that Korea did not have a post-colonial moment. Laos was in a similar situation with the overlap between the end of French colonialism and then US military occupation. So secret war and secrecy as a structure allows us to sort of think about how US imperialism operates in Asia and globally, and also structures how knowledge about these imperialist wars circulate. So the images that I have on the slide here, so the top left with the soldiers, and there are World War II weapons, right? This is an image of some of the recruits and their training, Hmong recruits in the training in the early 1960s to fight and to form this proxy army, right? So the secrecy, emphasis on the secret army for US empire peaked at nearly 40,000 soldiers at the war's height. But it also obscured a Hmong struggle for sovereignty through the overlapping forms of imperialism and Laotian decolonization. So in the training of these first recruits in the early 1960s, we can see the ways in which Hmong were brought into US imperial war through their so-called closeness to nature. right? So and therefore as expendable, right? They formed a proxy army so that the United States didn't have to send its own troops into Laos. And I'm just going to read a short quote from a CIA historian who describes this, uses colonial tropes to describe Hmong people and how they're close to nature. And I quote here: "Serendipity appeared in the person of a Hmong tribesman who jogged up the slope of the tireless gait of mountain people, running on the leathery feet and splayed toes of a man who had never worn shoes. So this description of a Hmong man coming to the rescue of Bel Lair, who was the initial CIA recruiting Hmong soldiers, and Lair's soldier in a tireless gait with leathery feet, likens Hmong to the natural landscape of a mountain people, so that Hmong physical features are figured as extensions of this landscape, right? And because they are, it was a landscape that was unnavigable for the U.S., that it would seem natural that folks who live there would be able to do this work. And so this army formed the ground troops and aided the U.S. covert bombing missions against Pathet Lao communist forces to intercept the North Vietnamese army supply route, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran through eastern Laos. And flying these bombing missions were U.S. American pilots who were discharged and then re-enrolled as volunteers, Thai pilots, and then eventually Hmong pilots. They dropped more than 207 million bombs, amounting to 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos. In all, the U.S. Secret Army provided intelligence, engaged in armed combat, rescued American pilots, whether they were dead and alive, flew bombing missions, and took part in various other military duties. So the image on the right is a memorial that was funded by Hmong veterans in once they have resettled in the U.S. This memorial is in Fresno, California, just an hour from where I'm at. And this is a Lao Hmong American memorial, and it names, for me, it names this expendability and killability of Hmong lives, right? It shows how Hmong saved American lives in this statue. So the statue is like the two soldiers on either side are the Hmong soldiers who were rescuing this white American pilot who was shot down as he was flying bombing missions over Laos. And so the veterans that I interview talk about, in particular, how they wanted to create this memorial as a way to name the fact that 10 Hmong soldiers were sent in to rescue a downed pilot or recover the remains of a downed pilot so that it wouldn't remain in enemy territory, right? So for me, this is thinking about Gook as killable, right? And expendable, that 10 lives replacing one life, right? And then thinking about how Hmong Americans who are, so that these same kinds of ideas of killability are transformed or transferred when Hmong soldiers and civilians were displaced and resettled in the US. And on the bottom is an image of a bumper sticker, actually. So it's a front page cover of Hmong Today, which is a local newspaper. And I look at the ways in which, in the US context, Hmong Americans who are refugees or descendant from refugees encounter the racial terror of Gook as killable and as killer. And in particular, this bumper sticker refers to, this is Save a Deer, Kill a Hmong, the case of Chai Suo Veng, who was convicted for killing 6 white hunters and injuring 2 others in northern Wisconsin on November 21st, 2004. And Vang was hunting with others, and it happened upon land that was private property. And he was asked to leave, and he turned around to leave, but a shot was fired, right? And Vang was actually trained as a sharpshooter in the National Guard. And so he was threatened, and he shot and killed 6 out of the 8 who were there, right? So the defense claimed that, or the defense argument was that it was in self-defense, and actually that Vang was called Gook and Chink, and that he was a victim of racial discrimination. And the prosecution's argument was that he was a trained killer, right? Referencing this particular history of Hmong as trained killers, right? And during the secret war. And so the media coverage and the court case really highlighted this convergence of this history in Laos, but also the racialization, right, that refugees, Southeast Asian refugees, encounter in the United States. Next slide, please. So in thinking about the second question of solidarity, I have this, I pasted a bunch of this very long poem, but if you would like, you can Google If in America, which is a poem by Ed Lee, in which he wrote about Chai Soa-Vang's case. And I am moved by this poem and the ways that it recognizes Gook as a shared experience of racial violence and sees through it to narrate a shared humanity and a sense of solidarity. So I'm just going to read a few stanzas really quickly. If a group of angry hunters surrounds, curses at, and accosts you for wandering onto their land, if you apologize for being lost, inform you saw no posted signs, swallow their chinks thus, and Gooks taking over that, are walking away over mud and fallen leaves when a loud crack far behind you picks up black dirt, earth. And then the other stanza is, if after such slurs, pushes, threats in these woods, it is now also on you to assess if that far rifle still locked on your face just issued a mistake, a warning, a shot, or a murderous attempt. And the answer is your military muscle fibers act. And then finally, the last 2 stanzas. And if you did, would anyone even care what really happened that afternoon? 8 bodies plummeted to earth like deer. So for this particular poem, I'm just struck by the ways in which Lee is able to think through this racial slur and the capacity of the slur to bring the violences of the past into the present, right? And the ways in which bodies is featured so prominently in the poem, in which militarism is inscribed onto bodies, right? But the Asian bodies also reference killing and war and can be killable. So when I think about acts of solidarity, if Asians whose bodies are indistinguishable as references to all of the US imperial wars in Asia, how can we also point to the continuity of stolen lands, imperial wars, and ongoing dispossession through the logic of expendable life? And I want to really turn briefly to the image at the bottom of this slide, which is actually a justice for George Floyd protest in the Twin Cities, right? And in 2020, after the police murder of George Floyd. And the woman is Yua Vang Li, who is the mother of Fong Li, a teenager who was also killed by the police in 2006, but the officer was acquitted. And she came to the protest and she said, urging Hmong Americans, right, but other Americans to participate. And I quote her here. She says, "I saw that when it was my son, Black people aligned with us. It didn't matter day or night. They were with us all the time. And we must join them." Right. So for me, thinking about acts of solidarity or seeing each other and the recognition of the convergence of militarism and policing, right? That she saw her son's life was expendable and underscored the shared expendability, but also a shared accountability toward justice and wanting to and calling for a reciprocation of that relationality of both expendable life, but also of solidarity. And thinking through how Hmong American activists refuse to be an ally, right? By naming the very expendability of their lives at the hands of the police and of the US militarism. So thank you. I will now turn to Junyoung.
Hello, my name is Junyoung Veronica Kim, and I'm a core member of EKW, and my research looks at settler militarism, imperialism, and racial capitalism at the intersections of East Asia and Latin America and across hemispheric Asian American diasporas. So I want to begin by why we in EKW came up with this module, because obviously this is not the common idea when you think about modules, the genealogy of the Gook. Because we're thinking precisely, and Christine brought this up about the term Gook, like where is it used? Why is it used? What does it encounter? And precisely what it does is that it allows us to think about the intimacy between militarism and racism and how the racial logics of militarism make an empire work, right, in many ways. And on the other side, the term Gook, as we've seen, allows us to map a trajectory of empire across different sites, different places, different situations, different peoples. So in relation to this, what I want to share today is a quote from Rolando Hinojosa's The Use of Servants. And I'm going to just quote this right here. "Learn this from Runner. K's call their homeland Hanguk. Hanguk? Does Gook come from that? Hook Fraser was once married to a Puerto Rican. She died in the Philippines while Hook was stationed there. Hook says that Puerto Ricans were called Gooks by GIs stationed in the Caribbean." So for those who might not know, so this comes from Ronaldo Hinojosa's Use of Servants, who Ronaldo Hinojosa also served actually as a soldier, as a Chicano soldier in the Korean War. And the Use of Servants is part of this trilogy, what is called the Korean War trilogy. It's a literary text. And precisely it's a text that looks at that juxtaposes the Mexican-American War and the Korean War as part and parcel of a continuous US imperial project. So looking at this context, if we trace the word Gook in this quote, we see how it arises. He's thinking about this word because he hears this in Korea. And then he has a fellow soldier who says, "Oh, but I had a wife," who says, "When I was stationed in the Philippines, it was also used in Puerto Rico and the Philippines." So already we see this very interesting kind of circuitous nature of empire and how it works, right? So thinking precisely about this is what do we mean when I say circuitous, right? We generally think about everything in bilateral relations, right? US empire here in the Philippines, US empire here, for example, in the case of Puerto Rico, etc. But if we link these together, we see a spatial and temporal cartography of US empire that actually keeps unfolding. So the history and infrastructure of US imperial settler militarism unfolds, builds upon, and continues transoceanically. From indigenous dispossession in the Americas and Latin America and the Philippines as empire's workshop, to the Pacific as US experimental war laboratory, back to the counterinsurgency, low-intensity warfare conducted in Latin America throughout the 1970s, 80s, and now to the war on terror in the Middle East and Gaza. So we see a circuitousness of this by looking at precisely the word Gook. Next slide, please. Now, in the text that people have quoted of David Roediger, which is one I would say the most read text about the genealogy of the Gook, he actually begins with a news article written by Herbert Seligman, The Conquest of Haiti, which was published in 1920 in The Nation. And he talks about how odd it is because usually we assume Gooks to be anti-Asian, right? And how it's used in Haiti. So I'm taking this quote, and I think this is very important because this occurs precisely during the US occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1934. And the quote is this: "The Haitians in whose service the United States Marines are presumably restoring peace and order in Haiti are nicknamed Gooks and have been treated with every variety of contempt, insult, and brutality. I have heard officers wearing the United States uniform in the interior of Haiti talk of bumping off, i.e. killing, Gooks as if it were a variety of sport like duck hunting." So again, we're talking about the killability and the technology of killability. Now, thinking precisely of Haiti, right? And Haiti is, as you remember, the first Black republic that was established in 1804 that very much was a distress for the Westphalian world order of sovereign Western, Euro-Western states. So in the US occupation of Haiti and the multiple invasions that occur before and after, we see already this racial necropolitical logics that hinge on the genocide of natives, of a de-indigenization process. In short, Gook designates the racial calculus of imperial settler militarism, right? So they must be killable. It must be made terra nullius. It must be a way that we can legitimize this killing. So the circulation of the term Gook questions not the dominant spatial temporal frameworks that privilege linearity and closure by bringing to light the multiple routes and circular routes of settler militarism, imperialism, and diaspora. And it also precisely pushes against what we were speaking about yesterday as justice as method, and speaking about the ways that we are enclosed into our disciplines. And enclosed within these disciplines, we are unable or we cannot, or it becomes very difficult to see precisely these connections that make the basis of solidarity. And what I want to end with here are actually two questions. So thinking precisely about the case of Haiti and Puerto Rico within this trajectory of the genealogy of the Gook, what is the relation between anti-Asian racism, anti-Black racism, and de-indigenization or indigenous dispossession? How can we think about these relations beyond just the superficial, like, yes, it's similar or parallel, but what are the intricacies, the nitty-gritty of these relationships? And a second question that I want to pose is often when we're thinking about the genealogy of anti-Asian racism, and there's amazing work, including Lisa Lewis' work, we think about this through the figure of the coolie, right? The racialized figure of Asian indentured labor within the grammar of racial capitalism. How can we think about the Gook, that is the racial calculus of imperial settler militarism, along with the figure of the coolie? How does this restructure, refashion, or reimagine the forms of anti-Asian racism that make the grounds of killability and vulnerability into a grounds for solidarity? So I'll end with this so we can have time, hopefully, for for discussion.
Thank you, everyone, so much for those amazing presentations. I want to say that the nature of the Ending the Korean War open access, our teaching collective open access syllabus is that it's a live document and it's under construction. So even though I shared in the chat a link to our sub-module, what everyone here today presented will be incorporated into that submodule. And we will also continue this conversation. We aim to continue having these conversations and to build out, following what Junyoung has done with that incredible image that she actually created, is we're going to map the term. And so there were so many interesting questions that were posed, and I wanted to try to synthesize some of them, but I also wanted to ask this question. Sungin, that piece that we posted in our submodule, Walter Sullivan's piece on how the use of the term Gook in the Korean theater by GIs could be seen as doing political damage. And so there's this like fear, like, oh, you use this racist term and it's demoralizing, you know, like when you're waging this war of imperialist intervention. But it's not just doing political damage, it's leading to mass death, right? So I wanted to ask this question about, well, there's something that he stated in his piece, and he said that the term Gook, it enfolds within it an inability to discriminate between friend or foe. So there's this racialized, it's racialized but undifferentiated mass. And Gook doesn't indicate friend or foe. It sort of bakes into it before this term is arrived at by war planners and war architects. It bakes into it collateral damage. So it permits mass death, be it friend or foe. And so I wonder if we could speak to, so there's a question that was posed by someone in the chat, by Sean, and it was about Gook as an umbrella term. And so we tend to think about Gook as encoding a kind of anti-Asianness that can be traced across these theaters of war. But Junyoung points out, and even in the Roediger piece that everyone has read, you know, like it's clear that it's more geographically multi-sided. The common denominator is US empire, right? It's US military intervention. So I wonder, when Sean poses the question, why does empire require a special term? Is it a special term? Or is it precise? So I wanted to, and then ask the question, weren't there existing ones that would have sufficed? And so I just wanted to pose this question. Anyone feel free to take it up. Forgive me, I didn't introduce myself. My name's Christine Hong. I'm a member of the collective.
I can take a stab at it. But yeah, I think it's an excellent question. And I think part of it is, thinking about genealogy of the term, and I think it's constructed in order to, as a way of constructing Asian killability. And I'm thinking about, like, it's a chicken or the egg situation. What comes first, killability or the term? And of course, it's a logic that inheres in a term that becomes reiterated over time and space. And so it's not necessarily a term that's invented to kind of designate killability, but that this killability inheres in a term that travels across time and space. And so I'm interested in thinking about that kind of materialist history of why this term has traveled across so many different sites, because, like, of course, it's, as we've all spoken to, there is a kind of hazy genealogy, like etymology of the term. Where does it come from? There's all these apocryphal stories. And so the origin of the term remains unclear, but the materialization of how it interfaces with the US empire is made clear by how it is used and deployed. And so, thinking about the origin story, to me, kind of points the question to how the term is mobilized as a way to think about this logic of Asian killability that has long been part of US imperialist warfare. And so I actually don't think it's a special term. I think it's a term that coheres a racial logic that is important for us to think about. But as we've discussed today, these racial logics manifest through other vocabularies, other terms. It's more of the process of how this term inheres within those kinds of racial logics of killability that is important to think across these different sites and geographies of US war and empire.
And as Junyoung said, I don't remember if it was during this session or a previous one, Junyoung, but when you were referencing the Atlanta spa massacre, the fact that, the sheriff giving speaking before the media in the press conference, his extremely lamentable response to the question of whether or not racism was at play, and understanding that only to be at play if there is an admission, an individualized admission of hatred, versus understanding that there is, as Keva is saying, there's already been the coherence of killability that is at play, but is not recognized. You know, and I wonder, Nerissa, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I wrote this also in the discussion, and thank you for that great question. I think that a culture of war requires different technologies. An empire as vast and as powerful as the United States didn't just, need weapons like in the 19th century. It was the Krag Jorgensen or the Gatling gun, the repeating rifles that were used initially at first on Native Americans, and later on this was transported to the Philippines during the Philippine-American War. It couldn't just be, physical weapons. It had to be language. So the work of language is part of death, in a white supremacist culture. And so I think what is beautiful about this difficult topic we're discussing in this panel is also to think about how the Gook ties us, how it binds us, that it is a word that is about, obviously it is about killability, but it is also a painful word that demands solidarity, So I'm thinking about how the collective, the EKW collective, thinks about justice as method. I think this is important for us when we think about these slurs. I think I want to go beyond the way I guess Jessica Hagedorn made a joke about it. It's always Asian woman is whore, 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 whore this, whore that, right? Gook this, gook that. But she ends her taxonomy of gendered and imperialist slurs with beauty. So I think beauty is solidarity. Beauty is the desire for justice. And so for us to even think about, the question of Mimi Nguyen about, liberal humanism, in the 1950s, it is important that it happens when the US and its allies win the Second World War, right? But the 1950s is the moment of the emergence of counterinsurgency as a military science. The United States learned, oh, this worked with killing Native people, this worked with killing Filipinos, the Vietnamese are now our new problem. Anyone beside the neighbors of Vietnam are a problem, right? So I think that, thinking about justice as method, I think it's important absolutely to concentrate on language and how it commits violence. But I also want to think about how language binds us in beauty and the desire for justice.
Maybe I'll just jump in really quick here to add to this, like tracing this term and language, but then also I think institutions, right? So to other institutions that might not necessarily on the surface be militarized, but are. So say healthcare institutions or medical institutions, and how the killability, or inevitable death, right, of Asian bodies in medical institutions, as racist logics are also practiced upon, right? That the body references both a site of war and a site where you have militarized care, right, being enacted upon, even in the U.S. context. So I told the collective this last time when we met individually to talk about this panel, but I'm looking at Anne Fadiman's book, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, as a book that you should not teach, right? So I'm actually rewriting about an unteachable text, but really it's making, and through the frame of Gook, actually, right, and through this session, thinking about actually why it's not teachable is because what it is doing is it is enacting those very militarized strategies of violence upon her body as violable and as inevitably dead, right? And so I think that I think part of this is tracing it, see how it binds us, but also how it actually binds other institutions into what might come across initially as mainly militarized, right?
Could I ask you a question? And this is based upon something that someone pointed out that's in the Roediger that we had in our prior discussions, which is that at its origins, the term Gook has not only a racialized connotation, but it has the very strong sense of being associated with women who are camp followers. And it's associated with sexual violability. Thereafter, because it's theaters of war, it gets associated with the enemy, genericized, often understood in very gender terms, not as women, but as men. And so I wonder about that sort of, is that lost as Gook travels, or is that central to Gook in its itinerary? And then I wanted to ask something else because Ma, you spoke about Chai Vang during our discussion when we were planning this, and you said something interesting. I'm trying to remember. It was something like, had he not defended himself, it would have been a hate crime. And so to think about the fact that something about Gook permits no resistance. Gook permits no defense. It's as though, and I say this about like North Korea with all these war exercises and these like, this sort of argument that North Korea should lay down its sword makes the assumption behind that is that the only reasonable stance for North Korea is to consent to the prospect of mass annihilation, which is already experienced. And that seems to be, so I guess like two things. One is about the kind of gendered and sexualized violability in the term in its origins, if we can, it's untraceable, but sort of murky origins. And the other one about Gook as encoding the impossibility of self-defense.
I appreciate that framing too, Christine, because I think that I've been really thinking about the term expendable, disposable, and I think Gook, as much as those are the terms that I would attach to it, I would also point to availability, right? Like the openness, right, which Gook sort of imagines people, but also that gets attached to the sort of sexual violence that is intrinsic in war and empire. And so I mentioned in my presentation that I think about the images of the Philippine American War that Nereus's work is really helpful for us to think about. But as much as I see the dead soldiers, right, that are in the archives, there are also just as many images of women who have been, right, available, present and consumable under the sort of auspices of the machine of war. So I think they're perhaps lost, but a need to, I think, resurface or latch on to that very important part of Gook's etymology and genealogy, which is the sexual violence that is always inherent in the war machine.
Anyone else like to close out? There's some wonderful questions in the chat. I think that we answered some of them in live time. There's also a question from, there was a question from James about, I may have missed it. There's so many questions actually now, but one thing that is interesting about the Roediger piece is it has an inaccuracy built in, even though it's supposed to sort of clarify the history. Junyoung, it basically says that the Koreans got the last laugh because even though gooks were applied to them, they threw it back in the face of the Americans by saying migook, as though migook came after gook. So it's so interesting, the term that designates, in the apocryphal story that Jenna shared in the opening, there's also then a kind of sense that the term can recoil. Like James was asking whether or not this claim can be tapped, like something that's used as a pejorative and a slur can then be used in a reclaiming way that changes its political significance. But we are at time, and this is a continuing conversation. We're going to pitch this for the American Studies Association, and we hope that some of you will be there. And please watch as the submodule blooms, with this conversation. It's going to be very vibrant, and we hope that you will all make use of it. Thank you everyone for coming. We really thank Lisa Lowe for hosting us and for Yale and for making this possible. And I have been saying this has been 4 years in the making, and it's been a more or less continuous process. And we hope that the discussion that we have here will take the form of a collection of essays, a continuing conversation in different spaces, as well as a mapping project. And we thank you all. On behalf of the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective, which aims to teach the Korean War, not as something that's specific to the Korean people, isolated to the Korean peninsula, but as an infrastructure of counterinsurgent violence that is far-reaching across the globe. We thank you. We invite you to organize with us, to build the syllabus with us, and to continue the conversation with us. Thank you, everyone, so much.